first came to Seoul last October, and it was very cold. I almost said a rude word, but it was very cold. But I loved it so much I wanted to come back, especially the kimchi. Kimchi, is it? You call it kimchi? Kimchi. Yeah. I love that. And so I come back. Once I saw the UN was going to be here, I thought, no, I can't miss the UN and kimchi together. I'm going to make a short. Denmark didn't win any prizes, right? But I'm also from the UK. I was born in the UK, live in Denmark now, and I travel around Europe a lot. So Europe was number one regionally. You saw that, okay? So maybe I can speak in terms of that, but I'm going to speak more broadly anyway. In Europe, we basically have dropped the name e-government. I mean, I know I've got a few Europeans here, so don't contradict me. Not now, you can do that afterwards. But as regard what the European Commission has promoted, and Dinad and myself and Frank over there, we do a lot of work in those circles. The label at the moment is ICT-enabled public sector innovation. And you can see it doesn't roll off the tongue very easily, right? It's difficult to say. So maybe there'll be another label shortly, I don't know. But that's what it is at the moment. And there's a lot to learn from Europe. But Europe also has a lot to learn from the rest of the world, of course. And certainly some of the winners' presentations earlier on, and I guess we'll get some more shortly, really will be useful. So this is what I'm going to talk about, basically. And okay. So the... Yeah, I turned it off, sorry, yeah. Basically, the European level, we're playing with new ideas about what some of us are calling the open governance system. We have to think of government as just one actor, of course, in the governance system. But the system needs to be open. Perhaps not in every context, because obviously we need security and we need to fight crime, but much more open than it is now. But how do we manage to do that? And it's also important, I think, in this context to think about, we're not just talking about doing more for less. We've had this for the last, I don't know how many years, 6 or 7 years, doing more for less. There's a limit to how much you can cut down government, and then you get to nothing at all, right? But government is able to, by being open, to work with other actors, civil society, particularly in relation to services, but also with the public sector, but also many committed individuals. Is actually able to leverage a lot more through being open. So that's why I've entitled this, Doing More with More. It sounds a bit cheeky, I know. I'm not suggesting that government should necessarily grow. I'm suggesting that there's a lot of things out there which can be mobilized to actually achieve meet some of the wicked problems which we've been talking about yesterday. I won't go through them again. But this idea that, you know, cutting back on government all the time is of course very important. Government's performance needs to be improved. Its efficiency needs to be improved dramatically. But sometimes government may need to increase its size. And there's lots of examples where that would happen in the context of environmental controls, for example. There's no one here from the US, I don't think, is there? I mean, sure. I mean, many of us in Europe would say the US needs to increase the size of government, but that's another discussion. So I think what we really should be talking about, and my colleague Goran reminded me this morning, it should be right-sizing government. We should think about right-sizing government, not always necessarily cutting it. But right-sizing will depend on the government, it will depend on the particular task you want to do it. And it's something which is always changing. To be flexible like that, I think that's very important. But what we're talking about, many of us in Europe and the European Commission are working on these lines at the moment, is thinking about 3 types of openness. The first, I think, in many ways, I think for me, the most important is open assets. This clearly is about open data, but there's a lot more apart from data which should be open. Information, content, applications, infrastructures, but also people and their competencies, and also buildings and vehicles and other facilities. The public sector, on behalf of the society at large, it has a lot of facilities and assets which you can make more open. And in many countries, in the US, for example, they're using some of these assets a lot more innovatively than we are. And not at the federal level, but in many cities, for example, in San Francisco. They're making all their assets open. Obviously, there has to be controls and other things as well. But so open assets is not just about data. Data is the easy one and the obvious one, although it's not easy implementing it. And we have a huge problem in actually using open data to actually generate growth and jobs, as we've been talking about. That's another discussion which we can take up. But open assets, making assets open and encouraging other actors in society, the public sector, the private sector, civil society, and all those geeks out there and other champions and individuals who are really enthusiastic about helping other people in society, they can also contribute assets to this in this context, I think. If the interface of open assets to open engagement is transparency and accountability. Once you open up information and data and processes and all the other things, then you can open up your engagement much more broadly. And we're not, of course, we're talking about open participation, open engagement, open decision making in those areas where it makes sense, of course, not every area, I guess. But we're talking about more than that. We're talking about open engagement in the context of how the government works, how the government is structured, what processes should be. You know, when you make a complaint, what processes should be available there? And can you see that it's an open process that you can actually criticise and get engaged with? So there's a whole lot of other areas of openness, getting people involved in planning procedures, obviously at local level very often. So open engagement is not just about participation in participation. It's much broader than that, I think. And it's also not just about E. Although E, you know, IT is the facilitator of many of these things, it doesn't always have to be the tool that you use. Of course, we see many fantastic uses of IT in government in physical meetings, like hackathons, which many governments are using now to develop applications based upon open data. But people don't do it remotely, and they do as well, but they actually get together and eat pizza together and brainstorm and have a great time and develop new ideas on that basis by drinking and eating and talking together. So that's also very important. But the third big area of openness here is, of course, open services. And we're talking here about co-creation, of course, where you release your data, you release other assets, and you can start engaging and developing services together. So a lot of the new moves in terms of open data are to co-create services with citizens. But in many cases, it's also about citizens creating their own services, of course, or maybe even usurping the role of government. There's two great examples from the Netherlands, which I'm sure Dinah knows, about 5 or 6 more years ago. The citizens around Schiphol Airport, Amsterdam Airport, were so fed up with the noise, and the government wasn't listening to the Civil Aviation Authority. They decided to put sensors up in their back gardens and link them to a website, and actually had their own noise measurement website, which was shown quite shortly to be much more accurate than the government's own. And then eventually the government accepted this and said, okay, this is the website we should use in future. It became the official website. So this was an example where citizens saw there was something wrong, or the government wasn't doing its job well enough. And a more recent example in the Netherlands, up in the north of the Netherlands, I think where they pump lots of gas out of the ground. There's been lots of earthquakes, but the body in government which was responsible for looking at that weren't really interested. So the citizens in many communities got together and documented this, putting sensors on walls and showing cracks with photographs, and put this on a website and developed Facebook and other social media around that, and actually developed such a powerful lobby from the bottom that the government were later forced to act. So there's all those things as well, where if you release the data, if you enable people to have tools, if you're much more open in the way you engage with people, you can actually get these new forms of activity taking place. I've probably used all my time now. Right. So I better move on quickly. The next thing, there's a couple of new trends I wanted to talk to you about very, very briefly, which we're seeing in many European countries, also in the US and in Australia as well, and other places, and Estonia, Finland, UK, Denmark. I do a lot of work in Denmark with the Mind Lab, and I know that in the UK they've got the Behavioural Insights team, which has now gone over to Nesta, which people have been talking about. But I think the UK is a very, very good example. They've come furthest, I think. And the slogan they use is that governments need to do the hard work to make it simple for users. Think about it. You have to work harder, you guys, right? To make it simple for users. That's what it's basically about. And the idea is that we have to look, or the government has to look at the full architecture of how and why a service is used, both on the supply side, but also on the use and demand side. And this is basically very often an experimental and learning approach. But also has to be rooted in concrete and practical examples, through prototyping, through actually testing, finding out what works and what doesn't work, accepting failure, as we heard about earlier as well. But also, failure is fantastic, but there's two rules about failure. It has to be, you have to learn from it, of course. The other one is it has to be small and early, so that it doesn't do too much damage. Not like the banks when they fail big and late, and look at the damage they did, right? So experimentation is very, very good. But there's a lot of new design thinking approaches around the behavioural approach, for example, using ethnographic and anthropological techniques, where you actually observe how users use services, which is happening in Denmark now, where the government is actually looking at and talking to businesses, how they use business online services, because they're notoriously very, very complicated. This is being widely used now. I won't go through all these different techniques in detail, of course, because I think that's a huge discussion. But having a dialogue with users, not just through focus groups, but actually people who are really using and having to use the services in the context where they use them. What we call cultural programming, and creating ideas out of that. Because users are different from different places, different types of users, creating personas. A whole lot of new techniques, but the whole idea is actually to really understand what the user goes through. And one of the tests they use in the UK, we're not going to release an e-service until the minister responsible can easily use it quickly and unaided. Okay? Normally, the minister is very IT illiterate, of course, right? So if the minister, he or her, can use the service very, very easily, that's one of the tests. The other test, which we've heard about earlier, I think, as well, is that other civil servants from other departments can test your services and see how they work or not. There's a whole lot of different things you can do, of course. But, I mean, the problem with this is, of course, people say it's expensive, it takes time. Of course, it does take a little more time, but the impact can be potentially huge. Now, perhaps I should finish, I've got other things, but I should finish by just showing you the example. Why isn't it working? Okay. Okay. Now, this is the UK's award-winning website. It doesn't look very much, does it? But it won a design award last summer because it was really simple to use. It's basically a search engine, a very sophisticated search engine, where you put in what you want to renew your passport or apply for a building permit or do whatever. But people use a whole lot of variety of different phrases and words to do that. But this website has been designed to accept all those in 99% of cases, right? So you type it in and you go straight to the service page. This replaced, about 5 years ago, a award-winning website, very sophisticated website, navigation, you clicked here, you went there, you clicked again. It was quite easy to do, it took a bloody long time to get there. This was called the direct.gov.com or .uk website. And I think it cost about £60 million a year to update it. This cost nothing virtually, once you've developed it. But what happened is another example, and this would be my last example, of users or other people usurping the government's role. This website 6 years ago was called direct.gov.uk. A little splinter group of hackers christened themselves directionless.gov.com. And they put up a very simple website, which is basically like this, a very simple search engine. And they said on their script at the bottom, we got so fed up with this multi-million-pound shambles, that we decided to make something better in under an hour. Unfortunately, we ran behind schedule, but we still finished before lunch, for free. Right? Luckily, the UK government was very wise, recognised this. Their own research was showing that I think maximum 18 or 19% of users were not using the main portal. They were going through Google or going through this hacker website. So they decided to bring the hackers into government, which they did. And the result was that the UK is the first example that I know of where they launched a new website in alpha version. And let that run for about 6 months. Then they used on the basis of that a beta version. And not just internal to government, everybody in the whole world, in fact. And they got huge numbers of responses, mainly in the UK, I guess, yeah. And then they launched this. Again, it doesn't look very much, but it's really powerful. And you can get to what you want very, very quickly. And who can ask for more? Who can ask for more? Okay. I better stop because I've got too much else to say. So.